The SpaceX Raptor and Blue Origin BE-4 are both methane-fueled rocket engines developed by commercial space companies. Compared to more conventional rocket engines, the BE-4 and Raptor are cheaper, more efficient, cleaner, and fully reusable. Basically better in almost every way than the engines we've relied on to reach space for decades. But despite using the same fuel and both powering reusable rockets, these two engines aren't just different in appearance. They also have some major differences in how they're designed and how they operate. So, why is that? What creates those differences? And do they actually make one rocket better than the other? Okay, first of all, after 3 months, Blue Origin has finally shared the results of its investigation of the massive New Glenn explosion. According to the company, the anomaly originated from the main oxygen valve on one of the BE-4 engines. Engineers later confirmed this by recovering the hardware and performing detailed inspections. Since then, Blue Origin says it has carried out extensive component-level testing, along with additional engine hot fire tests, to better understand exactly how the failure occurred and, more importantly, how to prevent it from happening again. The good news is that the fix doesn't appear to require a complete engine redesign. Instead, the company is making relatively small modifications to the oxygen valve, and those changes can be quickly retrofitted onto engines that have already been built. So hopefully, this is one of those problems that's painful to discover once, but only once. Now, with that out of the way, let's finally put the BE-4 and Raptor side by side. So, what do these two engines actually have in common? Well, probably the biggest similarity is the fuel they use. Both the Raptor and the BE-4 run on methane. That's definitely not a coincidence. There's actually a long list of reasons why methane makes so much sense, especially for the kind of rockets these engines are designed to power. For decades, most rockets burned RP-1, which is basically an ultra-purified version of kerosene. Rockets like Falcon 9, Soyuz, and Atlas V all use it. It works great, but the problem is it burns kind of like the cheap pan you forgot to wash after cooking. No matter how careful you are, something always sticks. RP-1 is made up of dozens of different hydrocarbon molecules, so it never burns perfectly. Instead, it leaves behind carbon deposits, basically soot, that slowly builds up inside the engine. Over time, that soot can clog injectors, coat turbine blades, and shorten the engine's lifespan. Methane doesn't really have that problem. Since it's just CH4, a single, simple molecule, it burns incredibly cleanly, leaving almost no carbon behind. No carbon buildup means cleaner turbines, cleaner injectors, cleaner combustion chambers. Basically, far fewer reasons for your engine to complain after every flight. But methane isn't just cleaner, it's also more efficient. Rocket performance is usually measured using something called specific impulse, or ISP. A simple way to think about it is this. How much thrust do you get for every kilogram of propellant you burn? The higher the number, the less fuel you need to do the same job. That can mean a smaller rocket, more payload, or just more performance across the board. When methane burns, it produces carbon dioxide and a large amount of water vapor. Compared to kerosene, its exhaust contains a higher proportion of water, whose molecules are lighter than carbon dioxide. Because those lighter exhaust gases can leave the engine a little faster, methane gets a small but measurable boost in specific impulse. At the same chamber pressure, methane delivers roughly a 5% improvement over kerosene. 5% might not sound like much, but in rocketry, companies spend billions of dollars chasing gains far smaller than that. And finally, methane makes something called autogenous pressurization possible. Normally, rockets carry separate tanks of helium to keep their propellant tanks pressurized as the fuel level drops during flight. With methane, you can simply heat a small amount of the fuel into a gas and feed it back into the tank to maintain that pressure. That means no extra helium tanks, less plumbing, lower mass, and fewer components that can fail. SpaceX uses this approach on Starship, and it's yet another reason methane is such a good fit for a fully reusable rocket. But fuel isn't the only thing these engines have in common. Blue Origin's BE-4 actually fills a very similar role to SpaceX's Raptor. It's designed to power both boosters and launch vehicles. It's built with reusability in mind, and, at least in theory, it's supposed to keep costs low by flying again and again instead of becoming very expensive space litter. Now that we've covered what they have in common, let's look at what actually makes these engines different. The BE-4 burns liquid methane and liquid oxygen using something called an oxygen-rich staged combustion cycle. Now, what does that mean? To make a rocket engine work, you need to pump enormous amounts of fuel and oxygen into the combustion chamber at exactly the right pressure, flow rate, and mixture. And we're not talking about a little garden hose here. These pumps move propellant at an absolutely ridiculous rate. Powering those pumps is a device called a turbopump, and spinning that turbopump requires an incredible amount of energy. That's where the preburner comes in. It's kind of like a tiny engine whose only job is to power the big engine. In the BE-4, there's just one preburner, and it's connected to a shaft that drives both the fuel pump and the oxygen pump. Here's how it works. When the engine starts, the oxygen pump sends a full flow of liquid oxygen into the preburner, while only a small amount of methane is added. Because there's far more oxygen than fuel, the mixture is called oxygen-rich. That hot, high-pressure gas spins a turbine, which powers the turbopump. Then, instead of being wasted, that same gas is piped into the main combustion chamber, where it's mixed with the rest of the methane. Everything burns again, and boom, thrust. It's actually a pretty elegant design. But like most things in engineering, simple doesn't automatically mean easy. One downside of an oxygen-rich engine is that you've now got extremely hot, oxygen-rich gas flowing through the plumbing. And oxygen really likes helping things burn. If even a small amount leaks into the wrong place, like the fuel lines, you could end up igniting the fuel before it ever reaches the combustion chamber. Needless to say, that's bad. To prevent that, the BE-4 needs very robust seals, which adds complexity and increases maintenance. Later, we'll see how SpaceX tackled this exact problem with the Raptor's different design. But before that, let's talk about something everyone likes: raw power. When Blue Origin unveiled the BE-4 back in 2014, they claimed it would be the most powerful methane-fueled rocket engine ever built. And at the time, they were absolutely right. The only real competitor was the first-generation Raptor, which produced around 408,000 pounds of thrust, or about 1,815 kilonewtons at sea level. The BE-4, meanwhile, generated an impressive 550,000 pounds, or roughly 2,450 kilonewtons. That's roughly 35% more thrust from a single engine. Of course, bigger isn't always better, but when you're trying to launch hundreds of tons towards space, it certainly doesn't hurt. The engine is also the backbone of ULA's Vulcan Centaur rocket. Its first stage uses two BE-4 engines, which together produce about 4,900 kilonewtons of thrust and can send around 23,800 pounds, or 10.8 metric tons, into low Earth orbit, or roughly 5,100 pounds, or 2.3 metric tons, toward the Moon. And Blue Origin didn't stop there. In November 2025, the company announced a series of upgrades for the BE-4, including a major thrust increase to about 640,000 pounds force, or roughly 2,850 kilonewtons per engine. That's a pretty substantial jump. Of course, raw numbers aren't everything. A rocket engine can produce an absurd amount of thrust, but if it slams the booster into the ground at a few hundred kilometers per hour, congratulations, you've successfully built a very expensive crater. That's why both the BE-4 and Raptor are designed to deep throttle. Deep throttling simply means the engine can reduce its thrust by a large amount while remaining stable. This is absolutely critical during landing. When a booster is almost back on the ground, it doesn't need full power anymore. It just needs enough thrust to gently slow itself down without bouncing, tipping over, or reenacting a Michael Bay movie. Now, as I said before, efficiency is everything in rocketry. For the BE-4, the specific impulse ranges from about 310 seconds at sea level to around 340 seconds in vacuum, depending on the version of the engine. That's considered very good, comfortably in the medium to high range among modern liquid rocket engines. Another number engineers obsess over is chamber pressure. After all, rocket engines work by throwing extremely hot gas out the back at ridiculous speeds. Generally speaking, the higher the pressure inside the combustion chamber, the more efficiently the engine can accelerate that exhaust. The BE-4 operates at a chamber pressure of around 140 bar, or about 14 megapascals. Keep that number in the back of your mind, because when we compare it to the Raptor in a moment, things start to get really interesting. So, the Raptor is a very interesting engine. Unlike the BE-4, which uses an oxygen-rich staged combustion cycle, the Raptor uses something called full-flow staged combustion. Now, both of these are members of the staged combustion family, meaning they don't waste the hot gases that power the turbopumps. Instead, those gases are fed into the main combustion chamber, squeezing as much energy as possible out of the propellant. The difference is that while the BE-4 has a single preburner, the Raptor has two, one oxygen-rich and one fuel-rich. I know that sounds like SpaceX looked at an already ridiculously complicated engine and thought, you know what this needs? Another preburner, but there is actually a good reason for it. By splitting the flow into two separate preburners, each turbine only handles one type of propellant. That means the gases are cooler, flow through the engine more evenly, and put less stress on the hardware. It's a much more complicated design, but one that's better suited for an engine that's expected to fly over and over again. It also solves one of the biggest drawbacks we mentioned with the BE-4. Because the BE-4 uses an oxygen-rich preburner, it needs extremely robust seals to stop that hot oxygen-rich gas from leaking into the fuel side, where things could get explosive a little earlier than intended. The Raptor's full-flow design avoids this issue entirely because the oxygen and methane stay separated until they reach the main combustion chamber. There are no seals between oxygen-rich gas and methane that have to survive those extreme conditions, making the design inherently more durable. That's a huge advantage when your long-term plan isn't just to launch rockets, but to send them to Mars and use the same engines again and again. As for power, the latest Raptor 3 sea-level engine produces around 250 metric tons of thrust, or about 551,000 pounds force, roughly 2,450 kilonewtons. The vacuum version increases that to 275 metric tons, or around 606,000 pounds force, which is about 2,700 kilonewtons. So if you're comparing a single engine, the BE-4 and Raptor are actually very close. Depending on which BE-4 version you're looking at, Blue Origin's engine may have a slight edge in thrust, but the difference isn't nearly as dramatic as many people think. Where things really diverge is at the vehicle level. The Super Heavy booster packs 33 Raptor engines, producing an incredible 18.1 million pounds of thrust, or roughly 80 meganewtons at liftoff. By comparison, New Glenn uses 7 BE-4s, generating around 4.5 million pounds, or almost 20 meganewtons of thrust. Of course, that's less about which engine is better, and more about the fact that these rockets were designed for completely different jobs. Comparing them solely by total thrust is a bit like saying a semi-truck has a more powerful engine than a sports car. Technically true, but they're built with different goals in mind. When it comes to efficiency, though, Raptor starts to pull ahead. The Raptor 3 has a sea-level specific impulse of around 350 seconds, while the BE-4 reaches about 310 seconds at sea level and roughly 340 seconds in vacuum. So, if two identical rockets carried the same amount of propellant, the one using Raptors could potentially deliver more payload or achieve a higher final velocity simply because it's wasting less energy. Another area where the Raptor really stands out is chamber pressure. Back in 2019, SpaceX achieved a chamber pressure of 257 bar, or about 25.7 megapascals, setting a new record for a rocket engine. Most companies would have proudly kept that record on the wall for the next decade. SpaceX looked at it and apparently decided it wasn't stressful enough. By the time Raptor 3 arrived, the engine had reached around 350 bar during testing, with a nominal operating pressure of roughly 330 bar. Compare that to the BE-4's 140 bar, and you start to understand just how aggressive the Raptor's design really is. Generally speaking, higher chamber pressure allows the exhaust to leave the nozzle at higher velocity, improving efficiency. But it's not quite as simple as saying higher pressure equals a better engine. Rocket nozzles have to deal with the atmosphere around them. The pressure outside the rocket changes dramatically from sea level to space, and an engine that's perfectly optimized for one environment won't be perfectly optimized for the other. That's why rockets often use separate sea level and vacuum engines with different nozzle sizes. Finally, there's one last comparison worth mentioning: burn time. During testing, a Raptor 3 has run continuously for 354 seconds, or just under 6 minutes, while the longest publicly reported BE-4 burn is around 299 seconds, just shy of 5 minutes. On paper, that seems like another win for Raptor. However, there's an important asterisk here. Those record Raptor burns were achieved during controlled ground tests, whereas real flights are much less forgiving. Earlier versions of the Raptor have occasionally suffered shutdowns or engine failures before reaching those theoretical limits. Meanwhile, the BE-4 has begun building a solid flight record on Vulcan and New Glenn. That doesn't necessarily make it the more capable engine, but it does show that reliability isn't just about what happens on the test stand. That said, SpaceX has improved the Raptor at an astonishing pace. Every new generation has become more powerful, more efficient, and more reliable than the last. So if history is any indication, this particular gap probably won't stay open for very long. So, which engine is better in the end? The engineering behind both the BE-4 and Raptor is honestly mind-blowing. Just getting either of these engines to work is an incredible achievement, and both are among the most advanced rocket engines ever built. That said, if we're comparing the numbers we looked at today, the Raptor currently has a pretty clear edge. Its full-flow staged combustion cycle, higher specific impulse, and incredibly high chamber pressure give it an advantage in overall performance. But that doesn't mean the BE-4 is a bad engine. So far, it's performing well in the role it was designed for, powering a large, reusable launch vehicle. Could Blue Origin eventually build something even more capable? Absolutely. If Jeff Bezos decides that Mars is the next destination, we might see an upgraded BE-4, or maybe even an entirely new engine designed for that mission. But that's still a pretty big if. If you liked this video, you'll probably enjoy this one too. I compare SpaceX's rockets with NASA's and break down all the biggest differences. It's definitely worth checking out,